So good morning, everybody, and let me take the opportunity to welcome you all here to the 2019 NHBSR Spring Conference. For me, this conference is one of those true rites of spring. It's up there with opening day at Fenway and t-shirt skiing, although we haven't had much t-shirt skiing yet, and fresh potholes in the roads. It's always great to see all the friendly and familiar faces here, along with new faces who are here to drink from the proverbial fire hose of that this conference always provides. And so for the new people here, you will not be disappointed. And in fact, it's why me and my team come back year over year. We spend a lot of time at conferences like this, Green Biz, Sustainable Brands, Companies versus Climate Change, so on and so forth. But NHBSR, in my mind, is really the place to be. It's the perfect combination of personal scale and global thinking that I haven't really seen elsewhere. So the past few years have really been quite a ride. I remember when the current administration was elected, more than a few friends called me and texted me and asking if corporate sustainability was done and finished and I was going to close up shop, and that, all of this stuff was going to be swept out on a wave of deregulation and general disinterest in all things sustainability. But that's really not the case, I told these fair weather friends of mine. Au contraire, while government and the legislative process may be royally screwed up for some time to come, a lot of companies that we work with around the world, realize that they have an absolutely essential role to play in the future of our world. And while there's no companies who can claim that they are without sin, many, and maybe even most companies, realize that they are in a position to really drive true change in the world. And that's why we're here today. So whether you're in a large company with a staff of 20 helping you, or in a small company where you are one person driving sustainability on a part-time basis, or if you're one person in a large company driving sustainability on a part-time basis, you can really learn something at the NHBSR conference. I also want to take the opportunity to call out the students who are here and put them on the spot. Take advantage of this opportunity that you have here today. Introduce yourself to people, collect business cards, and if you're really bold, ask for internships. Make that personal connection. That is how you get jobs these days. These people here are your people, so take advantage of that. So my team and I have been doing the sustainability game for a long time. So whether it's thinking about material issues for some Fortune 500 company, doing science-based targets, or preparing a GRI report, we've been there and done that. And this space has evolved a lot over the last 20 years that we've been doing it, but we're always interested in learning from others, and that's why we're here today. And that's why NHBSR is so great, and that's why we've been a sponsor here for 3 Patriots Super Bowl titles, 3 Red Sox World Series championships, and a Bruins Stanley Cup, and maybe the Celtics this year. We will see. Michelle and her team always do a great job putting this conference together, and they always get the best in keynote speakers. But this year is different. What we need in this space now is not just another greenhouse gas footprint or another sustainability report. What we really need is new, holistic thinking that drives this stuff into the nucleus of how we do business and how our companies ultimately create value. I asked this question last year, and I'll ask it again. How do you create value in your organizations? What are the factors that drive your ability to create long-term value for you and your stakeholders in the long term? And what are the levers that you can pull in order to support that value creation process? That's the kind of thinking that we collectively need to do. And it's this holistic and integrative thinking that Carol brings to the table, and why I'm personally so psyched to have you here today. Carol's a thought leader who has worked side by side with Fortune 500 and new economy executives in designing and leading systemic business change and design. Through her academic work and in-house educational offerings, global speaking platforms, multi-award-winning books, and work on human capital management, Carol has helped numerous executive leaders see the possibility to change the nature of the work that we do in organizations. Igniting motivation, developing people, and driving innovation throughout those companies. For 4 decades, Carol's worked with the leaders of successful businesses such as Google, DuPont, Intel, P&G, and Seventh Generation, educating them to develop their people and ensure a continuous stream of innovation that continuously delivers extraordinary results. Carol's the author of several award-winning books, including The Regenerative Business, which you received here today. Her books are required reading at more than 100 universities, including safety schools such as Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. Carol was recently named Executive in Residence and Senior Fellow in Social Innovation at Babson College. We are so fortunate to have her here with us today. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Carol Sanford to the podium and the NHBSR family.
Great.
Carol.
Thank you so much. So the real important thing here is for me not to fall down. We've made all sorts of arrangements, so if I have to sit down, I will. I am so thrilled to be here. I love working with people who have awoken and are looking at changing the world. I'd like to give you just a little story about where that started for me. I used to hang out with my grandfather when I was about 8 years old up until he died when I was 14. His name was Noble. Such a powerful name, and it fit him so well. But everyone called him Shorty because he was 5'1", but he was a powerhouse. And he had done an education role for the ag extension departments for years in animal husbandry. And his favorite thing to do, and how he really made a living, was pig farming. I would get in a 1941 Ford pickup truck with him, and we would go around to restaurants, hospitals, and so forth, and take away the slop, he called it, right? If you've ever seen feeding pigs, you know what I mean. And we would take it out to the farm. He would open the gates, and you'd get a lot of welcoming noises running towards you, filling the buckets, and these lovely pigs would eat the slop that had been brought. He always left the gate open and said, "Come on, follow me, Cuddles," which was what they called me, my nickname when I was little. And we would walk down probably a quarter of a mile to a riverbank. And we would sit down and just wait quietly, listening to the water move by. And in a few minutes, because he had left the gate open, all of the pigs, there were a couple dozen, would walk down the trail we had just walked, and they would lie down by the river, including a few would go lean against him, just like you see dogs do wanting their ears scratched. I one day asked him, "Why in the world do you just let them out? Don't they wander off?" And he says, "No, humans and pigs are a lot alike." And I asked him what that meant. He said, "Well, pigs, we don't really expect them to be terribly intelligent and have common sense and so forth. So like you, we're always surprised when they actually know how the world works. They know where we are. They know we're going to go back in a little bit." So I waited with this dramatic pause he made. He said, "But humans, we expect them to be really smart, have a lot of common sense, good discernment, and we're always really disappointed when they don't." I couldn't quite figure out what he meant by they were alike, but this I knew was the beginning of the lesson for today. And the lesson was always in some form about discernment, about the capacity to make sense out of the world around us in a way that was more whole and more real. I'm going to ask you to do something today. You probably don't get keynote speakers asking you to do very often, but I'd like for you to get out a piece of paper. And it might be the piece of paper that you were about to take notes on, thinking that I'm going to give you pearls of wisdom, which I'm not. And I would like for you to draw a line down the middle of that piece of paper. And I don't care whether you get it exactly down the middle or not, just so you'll be able to do two different things as we go. Just like my grandfather always said to me, it's actually not important to hear what I think. I actually don't believe in the expert model. I believe the expert model gets us in a lot of trouble. In fact, I'm wrong about a lot of things. And your job today is not going to be working hard to write down and acquire what you think I know, but to notice what your mind does while you listen to what I say. And that's why you need the other half of the piece of paper. Because I'm going to be gone tomorrow. You can do whatever you want. But my job today is to improve your capacity for discernment. I'm going to suggest, and I can't see that, and I didn't have it on my screen. I'm going to ask you to, on that other half of the page, to make notes about three things. So I'm going to say something, and your tendency, if you're a note taker, is going to be to write down what I say like it's worth keeping. But what's really important is going to be what's on the right-hand side of your page, which is what is in my own inner dialogue about that. Am I disagreeing? Am I arguing? Am I getting ready for debate? I should warn you, I paid for my way through college on debate scholarships. So don't prepare to debate me. What you want to do is debate yourself. You want to really look at what do you notice going on in any cognitive dissonance. Like, that can't be right. I've known this forever. I'm an expert in that field. What's important is for you to write down what's going on with you. You can write down what I say, but it won't have much use to you for very long. I want you to ignore if you have a tendency, because I got these wonderful accolations for the way I was introduced, to not assume that I'm an expert, and particularly to avoid accepting anything I tell you unchallenged. Then what I want you to do, what does that say? Oh yeah. I want you to ask yourself, which things am I saying you find really disruptive and destabilizing? Not in a matter of she's right or wrong, but just noticing, what does it do to me? Or what do I do to myself, right, with hearing that? And see if it particularly disrupts anything you're certain about. Oh yeah, no, she's wrong about that. Well, just notice that. It's not important whether I'm right or you're right. It's important what it does for you. And then I want you to notice, particularly because what I'm going to talk with you about today is the affect, not the effect, but the action, the movement, the intentionality that happens on democracy from what I'm talking about. Because one of the things that I've noticed over the years that I have worked with businesses who might say their intention is doing good is that they are really careful about avoiding adopting old business practices that they know extract value, especially in regard to ecosystems. I notice they're terrible, if you'll excuse me, about adopting the working practices of working with people, which actually undermine democracy, and you don't see it. So you can check this for yourself and see if what I'm talking about makes any sense. All right, here we go. So I want to remind you just to watch for a couple of the things about I want you to write down what you think are. So if you envision democracy at work, and that's hard sometimes nowadays, right? Yeah. We find worry about democracy. What do you think the top 3 things are that are critical to having democracy work? Just quick notes to yourself. That's on the left-hand side. The right-hand side. That's your thoughts. Just, I'm going to share what I think my top 3 are. I have another principle, which is I should never give people ideas until they have their own in mind, because you can't improve discernment. So my grandfather constantly asked me questions and made sure I had my own idea before he told me his. That way I have a chance of holding 2 ideas in mind at one time and getting a third idea, which is actually the definition of consciousness, by the way. The ability to hold 3 things in mind at one time and to really be discerning about it. All right, you got your top 3. All right. Here are what I think the top 3 are. The first is we can't have a democracy that works if we don't have people who can have a strong sense of internal locus of control. Do you know what that term means? Psychological term. Means I take full responsibility for myself. I don't blame others, even if the most I can do is take responsibility for my reaction. The second thing is the scope of considering I can hold in mind. So think about democracy. If people can't have internal locus of control and they blame everybody else, think about what it's like if what you have is they have only internal considering. Now, internal considering means I always ask, how's it going to affect me? How's it going to affect my bottom line? How is it going to affect my freedom, my business? Versus I'm able to bring in external considering and I care about others in the world around me. I believe we don't build these capacities well anymore in how we are brought up, how we go to school, how we're put into businesses. And so the second thing is the ability to have considering for other than myself. The third one is we're mindful of the source of where our agency comes from. So we build companies so that we have so much coming from outside that people tend to be driven by the agency that comes from others, not the agency that comes from greater purpose. So let's look at these just a little more in depth here. So internal locus of control. There we go. All right. So on the when I've got real internal locus of control, what I'm aware of is, the old saying, the buck stops here. I no longer complain to anybody about it didn't happen on my shift. In democracy right now, we have great challenges to whether or not people will acknowledge that what they're doing has an effect. What would affect immigrants, or what would affect people who don't have equity in their income-producing capacity? Instead, what we end up with is the nature of control, where it feels like that it is really always about figuring out how to beat the game. Now, I'm going to actually, in a few moments, give you some practices that I think you're doing, because every one of you would not want to have a company, would want to have no practices that what they do is set people up to beat the game. You would want everybody taking full responsibility for what they do, right? Everybody here would want that. So what if I tell you about 80% of the practices you have in how you manage employees and how you do strategy probably are doing the opposite? I want you to take that into account, and that you may not be able to see it. It may be blind to you. On the same thing happens on the locus of the considering how much. My grandmother, told you about my grandfather, but my grandmother was the one who always, when I was young, if I was being very selfish and not sharing toys, would grab me by the nape of my neck, and she would lift me off the ground. She was a big woman as compared to Shorty, right? And she would say, "Don't you ever think of anyone besides yourself." And of course, at that age, I mostly didn't. She was trying to teach me about this. She was trying to teach me where the source of my considering actually should come from. And there are, I call four levels of being able to become externally considering. Excuse me, I'm having a dry mouth moment. So at the lowest level, we all want to be kind to one another in society. We say hello, we shake hands. The next level up of external considering, we want to be able to have empathy and to be able to feel how others are feeling. And then, as the Dalai Lama would tell us, we need at least to get up to compassion, where we can feel others' pain and want to do something about it. I'm going to recommend that true external considering, and you'll find a lot more about this in the book, comes from creating caring, where what you want to do is build the capacity of others to do for themselves and to create the support system that can make that work. And again, I believe democracy, we have to have that, or what we do is we end up with, so I'm going to give you a combination here. In our society, I think we end up with some people in some political situations which believe in internal locus of control. Yeah, everybody ought to be responsible for themselves. And then we often end up with another group and said, yeah, and we ought to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. And we don't create systems where we can understand the relationship between these two. And so they end up being at war with one another in the poll booth. So what I'm wanting here is for us to learn the nature of what it means to have the kind of considering which thinks about others, and it helps us overcome where we end up with it being all about ourselves and questioning it. Now, again, I think this is built inside of a company. And you might just think for a moment, where and when do people become much more internally considering, oh my gosh, how's this going to affect me? And it couldn't be my fault because someone else told me to do it. Think about how many programs we have that are structured. And again, I'm going to give you a few of those. All right, the last thing is about personal agency, where we can connect with some greater purpose, and that's what I'm sourced by. We will not do things we think are not right. I don't care if it's in the supervisor's guidelines. I don't care if it's in what the competencies are. I will not do it if it doesn't make sense. And this is kind of how I got in trouble all of my life. From the time I was in college, Particularly, I started speaking out and being dismissed from classes, being failed from classes, ending up in divorces because I wouldn't tolerate certain things. All of my books and everything I do is pretty contrarian, because I will not stand by if I feel it is not making sense for the whole to be healthy. If you want to hear more of those, I run a podcast called Business Second Opinion, and I critique Harvard Business Review one article at a time. Because I think what they do is promote too much of the thing that creates the opposite here, where we have people that end up, even when it's a benevolent authoritarian system, it's still causing people to take direction from others, rather than doing, as my grandfather said, build discernment of people to make decisions for themselves, which is why I had you write on the piece of paper. What really matters is what happens on the right side of your page, not anything I say that you write on the left-hand side. So this, to me, are the three core capacities which we need to rebuild. And I speak to business, I write to business, I do podcasts, I do blogs, I speak everywhere I can about what now in this book you'll find in chapter 4 is called the 30 toxic business practices. I have 104, but you can't put all those in a book. So we're going to look at those just really briefly. And by the way, I should warn you, in about 15 minutes here, I'm going to pause and I'm going to put you to work with that piece of paper you're writing on right now. Because the question I'm going to ask you is not what do you agree with me about, not what did you write down you want to take and do, but what did it do to your thinking? And how are you going to play with that? That's the conversation you're going to have in just a few moments. So, again, continue to listen. Don't prepare a debate argument. I do no Q&A because that's what experts do, so you can't ask me what it is I meant by something. The real question is, what do you mean by it, and where are you going to go from there? All right, so let's go. All right. Here is one thing you'll find in the book. I believe that the way we've ended up getting to the kind of the mess, I might call it, that we're in about thinking that what are called best practices, including some of your sustainability practices, I don't think best are best at all. And if you want to have that conversation somewhere, we'll do that too. And you'll hear one of them in here. But it comes from living in different eras through history that have caused us to adopt particular worldviews. And you're going to begin to hopefully question everything you do in terms of which worldview it comes from. And again, you'll have a little bit of this in the book. So on the bottom, the first one is the royalty worldview. We still carry forward much of the kings and queens processes. Anybody know where we have anything that looks like kings and queens and then knights and then dukes and then anybody recognize that? All right. So that may be one of the oldest things we have is building hierarchies. And there are people now convincing people, or at least attempting to, it's not working on me, that it's natural and innate in us, because I have built organizations without hierarchies in power hierarchies at all, but mental hierarchies, how to think that way. The next one up is a machine era, which we went through with a couple of industrial revolutions, and we begin to think of humans as machines. Can you think of anywhere we run our businesses that we think of humans as machines? Yeah, see a bunch of head shaking. The next one will really get you, because it's the predominant paradigm coupled a little here, is with something called the behavioral era. In case you don't know, I want to give you 2 sentences on where the behavioral theory came from. How many of you study behavioral economics or read books about it, right? And you probably think it's the hottest thing since sliced bread. And then there's the behavioral programs of incentives, rewards, recognition. All right, let me tell you where that came from. John Watson, who founded this, went to the oligarchs who headed mostly oil companies and the big manufacturing companies and said, look, if you'll give me what would now be a few $1 billion, I would like to build a lab, and I will come back to you and tell you how to control people in the same way you can control your machines. That was actually the bargain the devil struck. And they were given that, and then, of course, what did John Watson study? Rats. So if you manage rats, then everything John Watson did and everything behavioral theory said is what he brought forward. Then you're in really good shape if you're using behavioral theory. If not, you are a part of the conspiracy to program people to operate like rats in mazes, because none of it actually fits humans except at our lowest level of brain. And we have designed most of our organizational practices around that. Now, just pause for a moment. Think about what it means for democracy. Think about what we've going on in our democracy and a little around the world, where what we do is watch people behave a little bit like rats. So we are designing systems that we can't see. We don't know the history where they came from. And I gave you more of the history and more of the practices on that one. All right, the next level up, this guy is slow on moving. There were a few folks, and I was one of them, who got very upset as I watched behavioral theory. I was working on my doctorate in cognitive psychology, studying mental practices. And I'm watching this behavioral stuff, and everything in me revolted. But I was revolting from the time I was very young against anything people tried to do. My father had to put me in closets for hours to try and shut me up, even when I was 4 and 5 years old. The only problem with that was it made me claustrophobic. Otherwise, it just made me mad as hell. But what happened when I became a part of the human science movement was I knew that rats didn't quite fit. And there was a whole movement, Virginia Satir, Abraham Maslow, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, all of whom created the human potential movement. And even this morning, Michelle talked about people reaching their full potential. By the way, that's an oxymoron. Just think about it. But we say it all the time, right? So potential is kind of open-ended. But this movement was really important because it said there are some things about humans that are really different than rats. So they were trying to fight it. And unfortunately, they lost. 80% of the practices in companies are based off machine and behavioral theory with a sprinkling, just so they can feel good about themselves, of human potential things. All right? So anybody mad at me yet? Make notes on your paper. It doesn't matter what I say. Okay. The last era, the one that we're in now, has much more to do with and I've been working with regenerative practice for 42 years. This is not a new idea. It's not new to me. I stepped into the stream about 100,000 years after it came to life. If you've lived in an indigenous community or know people or have studied them, indigenous communities have been thinking regeneratively for years. And by the way, it's way beyond sustainability. It is not in addition to, it is not the next step of sustainability, it's a radically different thing. So I talk a little bit about that in the book. But the thing that the human potential movement left out was all of Earth, all of natural systems. Regenerative is about living systems, not natural systems, but living systems in which humans are embedded. All right, so now let me give you, and this slide was just to give you a bit of an idea about how the energy moves that, I think it is, if I can get the arrow to work, there it goes, that you can design from a regenerative mind, and you can start to build in some of these lower things. We're not going to get to all of that today, but just so you know that I know that there are some things in the lower levels that can work, but they don't work if they're not started from a more living systems mind. All right, so now we're going to look just at a few of the practices. By the way, this is the base worldview that comes from churches, from kings and queens, and from anything that was designed to protect us like the military. Here are some of the practices that we have from there. So I already talked about hierarchies, and I noted that one of the things that's happening nowadays is that there are people who are trying to get rid of hierarchies. I don't get rid of hierarchies. I get rid of the power of hierarchies and put it in the power of the mind of the people. And by the way, I'm not a consultant. Nobody can hire me to tell you what to do. I'm an educator. Because the only way that actually really brings about the change we want to be is to build the capacity for a different mind. So there is some suggestions for practices I believe are based on, oh gosh, how many hundreds of years ago? So the hierarchies, the delegation, management by objective, downsizing, and job descriptions. All of those are archaic, toxic practices that I believe, so think for a moment, do those undermine democracy? If you have a hierarchy and somebody knows better than everybody else, what does that do to how we think about voting? I found me a couple of years ago. I was shocked. I shouldn't be. I'm just as human as everybody else. I was calling a friend in the little town that I moved to and said, all right, the city council is being elected. I don't know who to vote for. You've been around here a long time. Tell me who to vote for. That's actually a hierarchical expert idea. And thank goodness he said to me, shoot, I don't know. I'll tell you what I think. You tell me what you care about and we'll talk. All right, that would be a quite different process. The next era is the machine era, and I want, again, to look at the kind of practices that undermine internal locus of control, external considering, and having a higher purpose in our agency. So here are the practices I think are toxic and deadly. By the way, I do have something you can do that's better than these. And the workshop I'm going to do right after today gives you thoughts about what is a better method than this. Feedback. I have another brand new book out, the one after the one that you've just got, called No More Feedback. And its subtitle is Cultivating Consciousness at Work. Because feedback undermines the capacity for consciousness. It is a machine metaphor that you use to shut off an overflow. It's a governor that when it gets that feedback shuts things off. And it actually affects the mind the same way. And you should write on the right-hand side right now, because most people do, oh no, but I've gotten so much out of feedback. Well, you've gotten more downside, and what you got was probably not right, because 90% of it turns out to be projection. It belongs to the person who gave it to you. Or it's racist, or it has so many problems, and some of you are going, yeah, I've had that experience. So what will we do instead? Well, we'll talk about them in the workshop, or you'll find it in the book. Core competencies, generic standards, recruitment, problem solving. Who thought problem solving was toxic? It is the process that starts with everything is broken and figures how to fix it, which means you start from existence rather than the essence of what it is and what you could go toward. So there are much more powerful ways to work on this. I don't know what that word says, but I think it's supposed to be polarized evaluation. I did run a spell check, but I'm not very good at it. All right, so now let's go look at the behavioral theory. Don't you like this picture? This is exactly what John Watson promised. I'll be able to teach you how to manipulate your people. And if you have any behavioral programs, this is the actual experience of being inside of them. All right, so here are the practices, and I obviously couldn't put them all on a slide, but incentives, rewards, recognition, rating and ranking, role modeling, performance reviews. Now, most of you probably started figuring out performance reviews have problems, right? No? They have terrible problems. But what you may not have thought about is role modeling. I mean, aren't I supposed to be role modeling for my children, for others? Well, only if you want them to be like you and not think for themselves and copy everything you do, then yes, you should role model. But if not, what you want to do is inviting people, like my grandfather did, to never accept his ideas, but to always ask what mine were and how mine were different than his and what I added by understanding my own thinking compared to his. Rewards and recognition, we think, oh my goodness, aren't we supposed to do that? Well, I could go on for days about John Watson, and again, there's a lot on in the book, but mostly what those do is treat you to be rats in a maze. They don't teach people to learn to do something for the higher purpose on the process of higher purpose source of agency. All right, let's look here. I just said that. So I'm going to skip, if I can get this to go. I'm going to skip this because I've said it ahead of time and I'm watching time, and it's more important that you get to talk to one another than to keep listening to me. So the thing I've been pointing out continuously are the errors that we have in our thinking when we build internal practices. And by the way, what I'm doing today is based on the book, because that was interesting. I have a whole set around how we do strategy that are toxic, like visioning. It's toxic. That make you nervous? Wait a minute. Don't we have to do visioning? No. because it makes us not be able to see something as real and alive. We mostly do it with human projection because we ask the question, what do you want, you want, you want? We get a dozen people, 100 people, depending on whether we're in a city or a business, and we say, all right, what's the average of that? Or what could we get everybody to agree on? There's much better processes to do strategic thinking than visioning. And I got another 100 that relate to strategy and another 100 that relate to leadership. These are all related just to work design. You'd be exhausted if you hung out with me for a few days. So one of the things I talked about with the human potential movement as it came along is that it said humans are self-aware. They aren't rats in a maze. They actually can be aware, and they can do good in the world. They can do more than just follow and go find the cheese. Well, that was a good thing that they figured that out. But there are a lot of things that they did that you have as toxic practices that came even out of that movement. I don't think I have a slide for it. I noticed a while ago it was gone. So let me just give you a few. How many of you have taken a typological assessment to know what type you are? And did you love doing that? It's toxic. You are not one of a type. There's no such thing. And in fact, there's now research showing that there's no research on that. And it came out of Harvard Business School and Harvard Education. If you want to just double check it, go look at Todd Rowe's book, The End of Average. All typologies are toxic, including when we do them of landmass and make them generic and across all of them. Ideals, when we develop ideals, we're mostly preparing ourselves to colonize other people's minds or nations, whatever comes first. Certifications, and you've been up here on the stage all morning talking about certifications. They are toxic. Are you writing on the right-hand side of your paper? Because the toxicity comes from making things generic, from making them fragmented, getting the top 10. They may or may not be nodal to what's going on. There are much better ways to do it, but I hate it when I see good people, good organizations building everything they do around certifications and averaging or of selecting out what they think are core things. And then, of course, there's human-centered design. I mean, think about that for a moment. Human-centered design. All right. I am about to run out of time, so I am going to just give you your exercise to do here at the table, because I'm going to give you more of what the living systems work is I believe you should be doing this afternoon, which is learning to see the essence of things. That's a funny word. Sounds like it comes from some kind of woo world, right? It has an essence. But if I ask you, do you believe you have an essence? Yes. Do you believe you are unique and distinctive from every other being on earth? How many of you have children? How many of you were children? Okay. If you have multiple children, you know none of them are the same. And there is at the heart something extraordinary about them that's way beyond their personality, of which we could do a typology if we wanted. But essence, you can't do a typology. So you find when you're working with living systems that essence is the thing that is most unique, which means there is no generic version, which we can have everything be tested against. So, again, forgive me for moving fast. When we got a little behind, I decided I was going to try and catch up a little bit. But we want to be able to move so that we can see things as non-generic, as unique and distinctive. And I do that by thinking about, that's why I said caring is better than compassion, because it means evolve the capacity of people to do on their own and to work developmentally. So the little exercise I asked you to do this morning is an example of a developmental exercise. Rather than becoming a note taker, you become hopefully a discerning thinker. And maybe you laughed a little. I hope you enjoy the jokes. I used to be a stand-up comedian, believe it or not, in my early 20s, and did a little improv theater. But the key here is that we really want people to be able to develop their own capacity to think. I have some things I do, which are build something called Promises Beyond Ableness, which evokes the personal agency that is about higher purpose. I build teams around only external stakeholders. instead of building internal teams. I don't have people comparing themselves to each other. Like, I wouldn't send out to you to compare yourself to one another. I would ask you to figure out how to compare yourselves relative to the lives that are changing of those that you're seeking to impact, including customers, including suppliers, including, I call them co-creators, actually, which everybody who is working to serve people who are buying from you and keeping you in business or your organization. All right, let's see if we can. This thing is slow. Oops. All right, here's your questions. You're going to talk to each other at your table for 10 minutes. I'm not going to pick up answers to this, but I am going to ask you to just give me a few reflections at the end on what this is doing for you to think about it this way. So think about, for the moment, talk to people at your table, looking at your notes, what was the value of having destabilization and disruption in your thinking? And you watching that happen. That's your first question at the table. And it's up on both sides, right? And then the second one is, what's the effect of watching your own process while you're listening to me? Is that worth doing? What's that about? And finally, what did you observe about the inner dialogue that was going on with you? Because that's more important. If you get nothing else out here today, it would be learning to watch what goes on as you listen to other people and how you question it, how you work on it. All right, you have 10 minutes right now at your table to work on those 3 questions.
So that you don't have any hierarchy or you don't have like any performance review process or something that is outside my box. That's what we do is
we don't have time to figure everything out for ourselves.
But to have those role models, but not let it get in the way of who you and who you be inspired by that full potential.
All right, let me bring you all to a pause for the moment. I love that there's all this energy, but we've got a couple of microphones, and I would love to have your reflections on what happened. So a couple people quickly come up and get on the 2 microphones so we can just hear what went on. This is how I get paid. You know, I didn't get paid for coming. I decided I didn't want to get paid. I wanted you to buy a book, and I wanted you to read the book, so we luckily had that happen. So this is how I get paid. You come share with me what went on with you. Go, please.
So the from the Hypertherm team is totally blown away because we do almost everything you said is not cool to do.
80% of what we do, right.
But it also immediately triggered some really interesting conversations that,
right.
though we often mean well, we might not have gotten to. So you gave us a very fast start and shook us to the core, and we appreciate that.
Yeah, that's great. My grandfather would be so proud of me. Couple more. I'd love to hear what else went on with people. Yes, please.
Well, we decided that we had to rewrite our employee handbook.
No, you get rid of your employee handbook.
Right. Chaos is, to me, what I'm hearing here, which is really liberating, given the fact that we really need to make a paradigm shift to get ourselves through this phase of self-destruction that we're in. So I'm so delighted to have gotten to be part of this.
Let me just to give you one thing as an anchor. Every business I work with, and this is written in Harvard Business Review, many places, shift their first, second, sometimes third year revenue growth to between 35 and 65% revenue growth. And it's not chaos, right? It's massive financial improvement, and they usually become much more systemic. So I'm glad. I just want to give you one little thing to hang on to, so when people say, but this would create chaos, please, a couple more here.
So, the 5 stages of grief?
Yeah.
So, I feel like that, I kind of went through that, I'll speak personally for myself then for some of the feedback I heard from our team, but, it was
more
like
feedback.
a visceral reaction, that this isn't true, this isn't right. And, like Hypertherm, a lot of the things that we're doing, we're holding up and saying, look, we're doing all these things well. So I feel like the reaction that I was getting internally was more visceral, and I had to go through this stage. But then our team, our table, we have. I'm going to make some assumptions, but I think there are some of us that are closer to 50 and others that are younger on the team. And those that were younger had a very different perspective, and it was almost like I was reading no kidding, all this doesn't work. We know that, we're seeing that. And now, we have 5 different generations in the workforce. So we shouldn't be surprised by any of this. And I think that this is really exciting, and it's going to cause us to stretch and really think more intentionally about how we're going to work together with everybody and be more inclusive in a workforce where we have people that are, hold on to things tightly like I do, thinking I'm doing it right, and hearing from younger people saying, no, that's not right at all.
Right.
So.
Well, it takes about 3 to 8 years to make the shift, so we'll talk about that more. But starting now, good place to start.
Yeah.
And one more over here.
Hi, my name's Esther. The first thing I wrote on my paper was, oh, shit. And I felt somewhat panicked, and I felt like I had a physical effect going on, but the last thing I wrote on my paper was, I'm okay.
Yeah.
Because I think
that's right.
We evolve, we start from somewhere, and we're doing a little bit of all those things you talked about. So
that's great.
Yep.
That's great. And one last one.
Yeah, our group talked about the feedback and how we should stop doing that, and how that disrupted all of our kind of notions of self-improvement and direction, how we can better ourselves. I just wanted to comment on the visceral, I think was a word used before, reaction to this kind of stripping down the old paradigm and trying to create a new one in terms of personal value generation and as a society. That was interesting.
Great. That's great. So I want to tell you how you can stay in touch. Besides the fact that my email is carol@carolsanford.com, it's all about me. You would be able to reach me at any time, but I am doing a workshop here for about an hour, and it's going to be what you do instead. All right? And the other thing that you can do and stay in touch is inside of your book, you will notice a half sheet of paper that's called the Free Book Club. I decided a long time ago it was not important for people to buy my books, it was important for people to read my books and to work through them. So I've created a series for each of my 4 books, but for a particular day, I'm making an offer for, I think, it gives you the guidelines. You have to buy a bunch of books. You then get a workbook licensed to all the people who are in your internal book club, and the workbook shows you what to do internal. Plus, you get 5 free 1-hour calls with me as a community on a certain that are set up as a date that you in advance send me your Q&A, and I don't answer the questions, but I do a webinar or workshop is more what it's like in advance. So if you want to play with me a little more and get shaken up a little more, then take one of these inside. It's also the way to start help move the company. I don't believe in consulting. I think that's, again, a toxic practice. I believe that what we need to do is be an education process of how I'm sorry to all of you consultants, but no, I'm not. The good news is that I want to move you all to being educators, because that's why people don't move, because we try and tell them where to move. We don't educate the mind that can move. I also have 2 kinds of communities that people join, a few thousand people around the world. Some are for change agents who want to learn to be, and I have one of my colleagues here. Mark, are you still in the room? Where are you? Okay. Mark Murray can tell you more about those also. And we have one for businesses that come as a cluster to learn how to do strategy different, leadership different, as well as work design. So there are lots of ways to stay connected. This has been so much fun. Thank you very much.